podcast is provided for informational and educational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. Because every situation is unique, you should consult with a qualified legal professional for advice specific to your circumstances. If you need legal guidance, please reach out to an accredited attorney or contact us to schedule a consultation. Hello, and welcome back to the Veteran Benefits Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Deming. Today is sort of part 2 of the Presumption of Soundness and Presumption of Aggravation series. Last week we talked about the Presumption of Soundness, and today we're going to talk about the Presumption of Aggravation, which is the next piece. So we talked about the Presumption of Soundness. If you didn't listen to that episode, go back and listen to it. But in a nutshell, you have the presumption that you were sound when you entered service, unless there's clear and unmistakable evidence that something happened prior to service. The presumption of aggravation is that even if you had a condition that pre-existed service, if they gave you a waiver when you entered service, if it was noted on your entrance exam that you had some condition and they said, well, but you're still fit for duty, we're still going to accept you into the military. And then that condition worsens during service. The presumption of aggravation is that service caused that to get worse. So even if you have a pre-existing condition, if it worsened during service and you have worse symptoms now, VA will look at the presumption of aggravation. And the presumption of aggravation means that VA has to show that it would, again, by clear and unmistakable evidence, VA has to show that something was not aggravated during service, that it was not just the natural progression of the condition. So the burden shifts to VA. And when we say the burden shifts, you generally, as the veteran, have the burden to show a current diagnosis. You have a burden to show that something happened in service. And VA is going to help you develop that evidence, but it's really on you to show that something happened. With the presumption of aggravation, if something was pre-existing and you have worse symptoms now and it got worse during service, VA has to presume that it was aggravated by service. And they have to show, if they want to deny the claim, they have to show that it was not aggravated by service. So it kind of shifts the burden back to them to show that something was not aggravated. This is an area that gets kind of nuanced. It's very fact specific. It's very specific client to client, veteran to veteran. We want to look deep into the details and see what your symptom history looked like before service and after service, and what symptoms started to manifest or were noted in your service treatment records during service to show aggravation. But yeah, when we get to presumptions, that's one of the areas that I think the VA adjudicators and the C&P examiners sometimes misunderstand the regulations. And we're talking about 38 CFR 3.306 for the presumption of aggravation here. So the question that we're asking with aggravation is, did military service permanently increase the severity of the pre-existing condition beyond its natural progression? So the keywords in that: permanently increase the severity. So not just a temporary flare-up that happened during service, but we have to kind of establish that it was permanently increased because of service and beyond its natural progression. So if you have a condition that's naturally going to kind of, symptoms are going to get worse as you age. Arthritis is one of those conditions that, as you get older and older, it's expected that it's going to increase with age. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that aggravates it. It's just, we expect that 5 years after onset, your symptoms are going to be at this level. There's kind of a natural progression. We're looking at, did military service permanently worsen it beyond, so more than what we would expect the natural progression to be. So we're looking at a pre-existing condition can be service connected. The issue is whether there's an increase during service. So that's one piece that sometimes people miss, I think, is they had a pre-existing condition, nothing happened during service. Now they're in their 70s or 80s and it's worse. If we don't have evidence that it worsened during service, this presumption of aggravation doesn't apply. So we have to show that something was aggravated during service. If there was an increase, VA must determine whether it was due to the natural progression of the disease. So, like I said, with arthritis, as you age, we expect there to be more pain. So if you came into service with arthritis and they gave you a waiver, and now years later it's gotten worse, VA's looking at, was it aggravated more than what we would expect the natural decline to be during service? So the regulation requires that VA consider all evidence before, during, and after service, not just service treatment records. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions is, we'll kind of dive into that, is if it wasn't noted on your service treatment records. It can be a hurdle, but it's not necessarily a deal breaker for the case. So the M21 is VA's internal manual that kind of takes the regulations and breaks them down into practical guidance for adjudicators. It's not technically law, but it's like the user manual for the laws that VA has to apply. And if we look at it and understand what VA is telling its personnel that it has to do, we can understand how to build a better case that's going to speak their language and get the evidence to them in a way that they understand. So the M21 tells the adjudicators, when they're looking at cases involving a pre-existing condition and they're evaluating aggravation, they have to review the entire record. They have to consider the entrance and separation examinations. They have to consider the service treatment records, the STRs, consider post-service medical evidence. They have to consider lay evidence. So that's buddy letters, personal statements, stuff that's not necessarily in your medical record. Consider the veteran's military duties. What was your MOS? What did you do during service? And that they cannot rely solely on the absence of service treatment records. And that's one of the biggest mistakes we see, is that it wasn't noted. Both veterans will say, well, I never complained about it, so I can't prove it. I'm not even going to try. Or they try and VA says, well, it wasn't noted in the service treatment records. So therefore, it clearly must not have been aggravated during service, because you obviously would have gone to sick bay if something was bothering you, completely ignoring all of the reasons why some of our service members don't go to sick bay for every condition that impacts them. So one of the biggest conditions that we see, or one of the most common ones that we see with aggravation claims, are flat feet, because that's one of the biggest ones that VA will give a waiver on. You've got flat feet when you enter service, but they're asymptomatic. So you just don't have as much of an arch as doctors would like to see, as what's considered healthy or normal. You've got flat feet, but they're not painful. And then over the course of running in boots with poor arch supports and carrying heavy loads, your arches start to collapse. And then they become painful. You pronate your feet, you develop calluses, you have to ice your feet. It's kind of a common pattern that we see with a lot of our veterans if they had flat feet on the entrance exam. And so one of the biggest mistakes that we'll see VA examiners make, kind of carries through the claim, is VA might say, well, it was a temporary flare-up. So yeah, you went to sick bay and you got ice for your feet, but that was just a temporary flare-up. That wasn't a permanent worsening of the condition. So VA has to explain why symptoms return to baseline, like why they presume that symptoms return to baseline. And again, the lack of service treatment records, the fact that you didn't go back to sick bay, doesn't mean that stuff totally went back to baseline. Why the current severity represents the natural progression. So if they're saying it was a temporary flare-up, they have to say, well, your current severity just represents the natural progression of what we'd expect as you age for your flat feet. And it's not worse. If you're 28 and you've got severe flat feet, they have to show why that's the natural progression of flat feet. And that's a heavier burden than what it may look like initially. And they have to show why military activities did not permanently worsen the condition. So they can't simply say it was a temporary flare-up because it was only noted in the STRs, the service treatment records, one time. That's not enough to prove that it was a temporary flare-up and not a permanent aggravation. Without explaining the medical reasoning, VA's rationale isn't persuasive, and it would be error for a rating officer to rely on an exam that doesn't have adequate rationale to explain the medical reasoning. So digging into kind of the service treatment record, we know a lot of you guys don't go get treatment for everything that that's wrong with you. There's op-tempo reasons. You don't want to be seen as sick bay commando. There's not time. It's mission critical that you continue working. You're just going to suck it up. You don't realize that it's, everybody's kind of dealing with some pain. You don't realize that something's going to, at the time, that's something that could cause lasting issues if it's not treated. There's a lot of reasons why people don't go to sick bay at the time that they're experiencing pain. Especially if it's something like it's painful feet. I mean, you could be put on a temporary profile. Is that going to be better or worse for your career than icing your own feet and taking some Motrin over the counter? I know these are logical decisions that people make while they're in service, and it can come back to bite you after the fact. But from a legal perspective, it's not fatal to your claim just because you didn't go get treatment during service. Same with the exit exam. And that's one of the things we'll see VA say, well, if it was permanently aggravated, it would have been noted on the exit physical. When people are getting out of the military, a lot of times there's some pressure. I'll just say, I won't, it can come from various places, but there's some pressure just to be fit for discharge. You don't want to go through extra evaluations. You might not realize that it's a long-term thing. You don't want to complain about everything. You're just trying to get the paperwork done so you can get on with your life. So just because it wasn't mentioned on the exit physical doesn't mean that you weren't having symptoms or you didn't have the condition at the time of separation. But VA will often say, well, it wasn't on the exit physical. It must have been a temporary flare-up, because if it was a permanent worsening, if it was a permanent condition, that would have been noted on the exit physical. And that's something where the lay evidence will come into effect. It'll come in handy a lot to kind of help fill those gaps and explain why something might not be on the service treatment records, why it might not have been noted on your exit physical. So one normal separation examination is not enough to overcome years of repetitive physical stress or self-treatment or all of that stuff. It's just one more hurdle that we have to kind of get over to show VA that just because it wasn't noted on the exit physical doesn't mean that there wasn't permanent worsening of the condition during service. So the more evidence we have for aggravation, the better. We can build stuff in hindsight, talking to doctors, talking about what the natural progression of a condition would look like, talking about what they would expect to see from the types of conditions that you served under, what your MOS was, what duties you had. So building medical evidence, if it's podiatry records, orthotics, x-rays, it's wonderful if you have before and after x-rays, but that may not always be the case. A lot of times you're not going to get x-rays of otherwise healthy feet in anticipation of what might get worsened during service. So, but having the x-rays after the fact and having interpretations from doctors that say, well, yes, this at this level and this age for this person with their post-service duties, this is kind of what I would expect the natural progression of the disease to be. And here's why I think this is worse. Getting a private medical opinion from someone, from a podiatrist or somebody who understands how to read those records can be really helpful. If you had surgery records, that's really helpful. Progressive diagnoses. If you've seen multiple doctors along the way, getting all those records in can be really helpful. Lay evidence is really critical before and after functioning, explaining how you had no pain before service, that you played sports in high school, whatever it was, showing what your functioning level was before service, your during service symptoms, and the permanent changes after service. So you are the one who can kind of explain, especially if it's pain or tripping or calluses on your feet, stuff that basically only you would be the one to observe. Getting that lay evidence in there is going to be really helpful to show VA the history of the progression of your condition. Buddy statements can be helpful, especially family and friends, people who saw you before, saw you after. If they see you limping and they can kind of pinpoint a timeline on when you were limping. I know a lot of battle buddies, you go back and you ice your feet together after you're running. So if you can get your battle buddy to write a statement about, yeah, this is why we didn't go to sick bay, or, but we used to go back and stick our feet in ice baths to be able to run the next day, or, so-and-so would sit down and have to take breaks because of foot pain. When he took his socks off, I could see the blood on the socks from the calluses rubbing on the side. Anything that they observed, they're able to write. Obviously, we've talked in the past about a good buddy statement. So getting a buddy statement from someone who witnessed your symptoms, they're talking about what they observed. They're not necessarily a medical expert saying, clearly the veteran's feet were aggravated during service because of what I saw. They're not the one making that connection, but they can help fill those gaps about what might not be in the service treatment records. And when VA is granting something based on aggravation, they're granting you the difference between what the baseline was and what the aggravated amount, what the aggravated level of disability is now. So VA has to establish what the baseline was. So if you had flat feet and they were asymptomatic at the time that you entered, that's a baseline of 0. And then if after the fact, military service aggravated your flat foot condition to a point where you're at a 30% for flat feet, the difference between 0 and 30 is 30%. If it's something like migraines, maybe you come in with a diagnosed migraine condition that's noted on your entrance exam, pre-existing condition of migraines, but you get a waiver for it because you're only having migraines like once a year. And so that's a 0% rating. And then by the time you get out, you're having migraines, very severe migraine attacks twice a month. They're impacting your ability to work. Now you're at 50%. The difference between 0 and 50 is 50%. If you came in with migraines that were at a 10% level, for example, and for some reason you were able to get a waiver that you can function because you're having migraines once every other month, more than once every other month. So you come in, your baseline is 10%. VA has to establish that was the baseline. And now you're at a 30% level. The frequency of your migraines is at a 30% level. The difference between 10 and 30% is 20%. You'd get a 20% rating for that migraine. So that's why it's important that VA establish that baseline. The baseline might not always be 0. When with aggravation, we're talking about what the difference between the baseline and the amount that it was aggravated, or the current level, is if it was aggravated. So it's really important, and there's a little bit of guesswork involved, but it's important for the CMP examiner to establish a baseline. So what was the baseline before the current aggravation? If they can't establish a baseline, because there's a presumption of aggravation, they have to establish a baseline. Otherwise, they kind of have to assume that it was asymptomatic. So they can't just say that they can't establish a baseline and therefore you get no money. Because with presumptions, it's a protection for veterans. It's a way to get you more benefits. So when we're looking at a CMP exam to determine if it's adequate, we're going to ask whether the examiner really considered the full spectrum of your service. Did they explain why the condition did not permanently worsen why your service did not permanently worsen the condition? Did they discuss running? Did they discuss ruck marching, standing, wearing combat boots, concrete surfaces, what your MOS duties were? Or did they ignore those facts and just say, well, I don't see any evidence of service treatment records that it was aggravated during service. I don't think it was aggravated. Also, did the examiner explain why they think the current level of severity is just the natural progression and was not aggravated by service? So did they cite any medical literature to talk about what the natural progression for a condition is expected to be at different age levels? Or did they just say, well, this, in my professional opinion, this represents the natural progression? That's not a well-reasoned rationale for providing a negative opinion. So that's something that we would dispute if VA relied on an exam that didn't give its rationale for denying an aggravation. So some common mistakes that people make when they're approaching their VA claims. They assume that pre-existing means an automatic denial. If I had flat feet before I entered service, I can't claim flat feet as a disability after service because they don't understand the presumption of aggravation. They might believe that a lack of service treatment records means that their claim is dead in the water. And like we discussed, there's ways to build that evidence around, especially with lay statements, buddy statements, personal statements, additional medical records, and prospective medical opinions explaining what someone would expect to see with the disabilities that are on the table. VA might ignore lay evidence, or you as the veteran might overlook the importance of lay evidence in these kinds of cases. Failing to establish a pre-service baseline can be a big one. So again, without establishing a pre-service baseline, how can VA say how much it has progressed or hasn't progressed if they can't tell you what it was at the point when you entered service? VA might rely solely on the VA exams. This can be a topic that, I think there's a lot of conflicting opinions and advice on the internet about whether to get a private medical opinion, whether to rely solely on the VA exams. I don't think there's one size fits all. I think a lot of people are going to do just fine with the VA exam process. VA has the duty to assist veterans in developing the evidence they need for their claims. And a lot of veterans are able to get the benefits they deserve based solely on those CMP exams. Sometimes when it gets into aggravation and if you have missing service treatment records or you're getting a lot of negative CMP exams, having a private medical opinion is going to be really helpful. Sometimes people want to start off with a private medical opinion because they want to put their best foot forward, and they're willing to put up the money to pay for a private medical opinion to help kind of steer VA's evidence development. That's a strategy that works for a lot of people, but it can be a personal preference, and it's very fact specific on whether it makes more sense for you to go ahead and get that private medical opinion or rely on VA and just kind of keep putting the pressure on VA to answer the right questions about aggravation, about what the baseline is, about whether something was permanently aggravated during service. So the key takeaways that I want you guys to walk away from this episode are: pre-existing does not mean that you are ineligible for VA benefits. The issue is permanent worsening, not whether the condition existed prior to service. So if you had a prior existing condition, was it permanently worsened because of your service? Lack of service treatment records does not automatically defeat the aggravation. So just because you didn't go to sick bay to treat for it doesn't mean that you can't show aggravation during service. It makes it a little bit harder, but we see that all the time. So it's not something out of the ordinary. It's something that we're definitely prepared to help you guys develop that evidence to show that something was aggravated during service. Lay evidence and medical evidence should work together to tell the veteran's story. So you can't rely solely on medical evidence, especially if you didn't go to treatment. You can't rely solely on lay evidence because the people who saw your symptoms often aren't medics themselves. They're not medical professionals themselves. So they're not qualified or competent to give a medical opinion on aggravation or on service treatment, but they can tell that piece of the story that's important for the medical experts to be able to connect the symptoms, connect the dots, to show a storyline of your specific condition and how it progressed and how it was worsened during service. A strong medical opinion should address the baseline severity, the military demands, what your duties were, what your MOS was, and the natural progression, not simply conclude that it was a temporary flare-up without any supporting evidence. So if your VA medical exam doesn't answer the right questions, if the person requesting the medical exam isn't asking the right questions, you're going to end up with an inadequate medical exam. And that's something that can be appealed. If we just appeal a decision based on an inadequate medical exam, VA has to go get another medical exam that is adequate for rating purposes. And so that's part of our appeal process. We'll determine, does it make more sense to go get a private medical opinion and give VA the evidence that kind of connects the dots for them? Or do we want to just hold VA's feet to the fire and make sure that they get an adequate medical exam to show whether there's aggravation or no aggravation? And when I'm talking about the CMP exams being adequate or not adequate, we as accredited VA attorneys, we have access to the Veteran Benefit Management System, VBMS. When we're representing you, we can see all of the evidence that VA is developing related to your claims. We can see all of the evidence. If you come to us, we can see all the evidence that VA has developed and added to your file for the claims. So we will get copies of those CMP exams, the compensation and pension exams, and we can evaluate whether the rationale was adequate or not adequate and whether to push back or not. If you're doing this on your own, VA does not release to you. Typically, you can put in a FOIA request or Privacy Act request, and eventually you can get your own CMP exam records, but it's not a quick process. So when you're working with someone who has access to your entire claim file in real time, so we can see as soon as VA uploads something, we can determine whether, what questions were asked of the CMP examiner and how the CMP examiner answered those questions and whether their rationale for their conclusions is adequate or not. It's a lot harder to do when you're doing this on your own or if you're working with someone who doesn't have access to your claim file. So that's one of the reasons why, depending on what your claims are and kind of how complex stuff is and how likely VA is to get something wrong, it can be really helpful to have somebody on your side who has access to those records, who understands VA's regulations, and can determine when an exam is not adequate. Sometimes we're able to see that an exam is not adequate even before VA issues a denial on the claim. And depending on how fast VA is moving, if we see an inadequate exam, sometimes we can push back to the rating team and get them to schedule a new exam that asks the right questions and answers in the correct way. Sometimes we'll work with the veterans to get private medical evidence that addresses the deficiencies in the VA's CMP exam and fills those gaps so that we have enough evidence for VA to grant it right away. And even if VA says, oh, we're just going to rely on our medical exam and not your private medical opinion, we have enough to support an appeal for a higher level review or a board appeal, depending on kind of the strategy that we're trying to get with your case and how complex the arguments are and what we think the best strategy is for you working with you as the veteran. So yeah, when I'm talking about the adequacy of the rationale in the CMP exam, that is something that if you're working on your own, you may not be able to tell, but the best you could tell is kind of talking to the examiner and saying, hey, I want to talk about my baseline. I want to talk about my duties, ask them questions about what they would expect the natural progression to be. A lot of times these CMP examiners don't really want to answer your questions. They're trying to get enough evidence to write up their opinions and whether they have preconceived notions or if they're doing an unbiased evaluation of you. Varies depending on the examiner and the way that the exam questions are asked. So I kind of wanted to put that out there so I'm not getting you guys all amped up about checking your CMP exams, because that can be harder to do if you're unrepresented. So bottom line, if you entered service and something was noted on your service exam, something is a pre-existing condition and it got worse during service, and permanent aggravation, not just, banging your knee one time and then it heals up. But if something got permanently worse during your service and you really think that it's because of something that happened in service or because of the duties that you had in service, you should put in a claim for it and hold VA's feet to the fire to evaluate it under the presumption of aggravation and understand that that's the evidence that you have to build, not just that something started during service, is to be able to show that something was aggravated during service. And it is a presumption. So if you're able to show that something was permanently worsened during service, you have the presumption of aggravation, and VA is looking at the difference between the baseline and your current level of disability to show the aggravation. And they're looking at what the natural progression of the condition would normally be. So if something was worsened during service, my suggestion is to put in a claim for it. Don't automatically dismiss that one because you think you're not eligible for benefits, because you very well may be eligible. And because this area can be kind of complex, it may be one where it would be more important than some other areas to get an accredited claims rep or an accredited attorney on your side to help you navigate showing aggravation of a pre-existing condition to get service-connected disability benefits. So if you have questions, pop them in the comments. We'd love to hear from you guys. We'd love to hear more suggestions for new topics. This topic was one that was requested by a listener, and so thank you for that. And we look forward to providing you more content that answers questions you have about the VA disability process. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.